Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at onscriptpodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/onscript.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. I just wanted to say at the outset here a word of special thanks to Jason Stark and Taylor Terzek, who are producing the OnScript episodes now. They're our new producers, and I really appreciate you guys and the work you're doing for this podcast. So as some of you recall, Ed Hatke, who had been producing the show for 5 years, has retired from OnScript, and he's still staying on in a sort of consultation capacity. But Jason and Taylor are doing a fantastic job, so we have them to thank for these shows getting produced. So thanks so much, and thanks to all of you for listening or supporting OnScript, and we hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello, OnScript listeners. This is Erin coming to you from Ridley Hall, the University of Oxford, and I'm joined today by my friend, Reverend Dr. Andy Byers, who teaches New Testament at Ridley Hall in Cambridge, what we refer to here as the other place. And he has my job in the other place as tutor in New Testament. Andy is here today to talk about his newest book on Johannine literature called John and the Others: Jewish Relations, Christian Origins, and the Sectarian Hermeneutic, which was published by Baylor University Press in 2021. Andy, welcome to OnScript.
Great. Thanks, Erin. It's good to be with you.
And this is your second substantial project on John, right? Second.
That's right. Yes.
So how did you get interested in John's gospel and become one of these Johannine scholars that seem to be off in their own sectarian little clique everywhere? How did you get interested in John?
My interest in John came from, personal and devotional readings of the gospel, actually. When I was at the University of Georgia and wrangling and wrestling over vocational decisions, wondering about ministry and considering the possibility of the mission field even, I ended up deciding I was going to travel around the world, one of these wild hair adventures in a way. And I remember reading through John's gospel as I was preparing to travel, and as I got the travels underway, I was reading John's gospel. And what really struck me is this relationship that Jesus had with his Father was something I was envious of. I wanted to have that sort of relationship with God personally. But as I was reading and rereading, I noticed that over the course of the narrative, the disciples are included within that relationship that Jesus has with the Father. There are these narrative techniques, strategies, often very implicit and sometimes explicit, that indicate that they are being included within that relationship. Now, I was reading this devotionally as a 21, 22-year-old with no aspirations for any sort of academic life at all. But it would have been 12, 13 years later, I ended up doing a PhD on that very topic, which is the book you've referred to.
And even knowing how sort of niche Johannine scholarship can be in the world of gospel scholarship, you stuck with it, not just for your PhD thesis, but also for the second book. So what sparked your interest for the second book off of your PhD research, perhaps? Because this is an extension in some ways. And
in some ways, you're right, it is. The first book is Ecclesiology and Thesis in the Gospel of John. And in the book, I am trying to recover this idea that I think has been lost in quite a bit of modern Johannine scholarship, this idea that John actually has an ecclesiology, at least not a formal ecclesiology, of course, the way we would think of in a systematic theological context, but he does have a vision as to who the people of God are called to be. And that, of course, is an ongoing topic of reflection and consideration for me. And this book, John and the Others, came about when I was invited. I was invited to give a lecture, the Tyndall lecture in Cambridge, and I decided to wrestle with this very difficult subject matter of John and the Jews. And that actually fits in quite nicely with the idea of who does John envision the people of God to be. And with a number of studies coming out that for me challenged, for me, I found to be really challenging readings about calling John anti-Jewish, and I had to wrestle with these projects. Adele Reinhardt's Cast Out of the Covenant came out, and I really wanted to wrestle with this text, not just academically, but also personally and confessionally as someone in the life of the church. So the project was born really out of that wrestling. I remember one day, Erin, I was walking in to work when I was at Cranmer Hall at the time, and I was walking through Durham, and I was wrestling over my vocation. Do I want to be in the life of the church, or do I want to be in the academy? And I'm walking to an academic position where I was training ministers of the gospel, of course, and I was wrestling with this decision: church, academy, and I remember stopping dead in my tracks. Really looking upward to the sky, wondering, what am I to do? And I realized I was standing right between Durham Cathedral on my right and Abbey House, the Department of Theology at Durham University, on my left. And I thought, wow, this is the vocational space out of which I write. And John and the others has come out of that space, wanting to bring the full rigors of the academy into the project, but also writing as someone who loves the Gospel of John and trains people to preach from the Gospel of John and John's epistles. So yeah, the book has come out of that wrestling.
And kind of along those lines, you wade into some pretty dense theological territory in this book, which is a little unusual for a biblical scholar. It's a little unusual in Johannine studies. So what made you decide to take that approach, more intentionally than just the light from heaven in Durham Cathedral? But what I think more more specifically, what place do you think that a theological reading like the one that you're offering here has within biblical studies, which doesn't always welcome such readings?
You are right to point this out, and I'm grateful you asked. Why did I do this? Well, I think this came out of a bit of confidence that I had that maybe I have the PhD, I've published the thesis, maybe it's okay for me to just own a little more fully my theological leanings as an interpreter. We'll see whether or not this works in its reception, actually. So I felt like, I'm at this point where my role as a New Testament lecturer is one of training up ministers for the life of the church. Certainly, I'm engaged very actively in various different academic circles than just that particular realm of seminary training, or as we say here in the UK, theological college training. So, I thought I'm just going to own this a little more. And I think my impulses are to read theologically and confessionally, and my thinking is that, there's a lot of talk within the academy of us owning our social locations. Well, my social location is that of an ordained minister who has a PhD and wants to do rigorous exegesis and teaches in a theological college or seminary. So why not write out of that? But I didn't want the theological dimension or the confessional dimension to be a compromise, of course, on the exegesis. But I did want it to inform that exegesis.
Yeah, and please don't hear me criticizing that, because I am one who, I'm deeply committed to theological readings, precisely, because I do a very similar job, and because I do think it's important to own our social locations, and that's also my social location. I think the question that I continue to wrestle with, and so probably the reason I'm asking you the question, is what do we think that these readings, these theological readings, have to say, not just to the church, but actually to the academy? And I think I'm still wrestling with that. What do I want my maybe non-theological colleagues to take from this? So what do you think a non-theological colleague should learn from your theological exegesis of John? What does it contribute to the conversation?
is it typical in podcast interviews to say, that is a great question to stall in your answer?
Absolutely it
That is a great question. Oh, super. That is an excellent question. I suppose I would venture this, that I think actually attending to the theology of an outwardly theological text is actually a responsible way to do exegesis. What I mean is, I think often within our academic milieu, we sort of come to these texts thinking we have to be as objective as possible, which means we have to be ruthlessly eliminating our presuppositions. And for centuries, of course, those who come to this text come with the presupposition of God, and that God is real and God is active through the text in some way. And I think we do have to actually be very alert to those biases and those presuppositions. And this is one of the disciplines for me as a confessional and theological reader, is hoping that the historical studies and disciplines around within biblical studies help sharpen me in my own thinking. But I also think that if we ruthlessly eliminate theology out of the text, we may actually short ourselves of insight. So I think someone who is non-theological may find tremendous fruit in understanding the nature of the text if they are willing to attend to the theological concerns inherent within it.
And so let's talk about those theological concerns that you think are inherent in this text. And I think one of them, this is a great turn of phrase, but you have a section at the beginning of your book on where you talk about the alterity of the incarnation, and then you develop that actually more fully in your penultimate chapter. So can you just talk about what you mean by the alterity of the incarnation and what role that's playing in this project about others and the others in John?
Yes. The book is written, I'm writing this book to counter what I perceive to be what I call the sectarian hermeneutic that governs so much of Johannine studies. That this approach to the text that assumes that it is antagonistic and that is best labeled with the prefix anti. John is an anti-society with an anti-language that is anti-Jewish and even anti-Semitic, and these terms are used quite a bit in the interpretation of John. And I want to highlight that at the very heart of Johannine theology is that the ultimate other, becomes flesh. So the incarnation is actually the most profound act of de-othering in the biblical story, and perhaps one might argue in history. So the fact that the ultimate other de-others by becoming flesh, I think that has to lie at the heart of how we understand what John is doing in those scenes or in the language that we find often to be more sectarian or more anti. So this book, this ancient narrative of Jesus, John's gospel, these scenes that we so draw attention to, like in John 8:44, for instance, which is a very difficult text that has caused so much pain in the history of the church and in the history of the church's relationship with Judaism. I think to read that without taking into account this theological idea of the other becoming flesh, Jewish flesh, in fact, I think we're missing something. I think we do have to attend to that theological anchor when we are interpreting John.
And it might be helpful just to maybe sharpen what we mean, or what you mean by othering and the other. So what do you mean by the word other and othering, and what sorts of othering is John dealing in his gospel?
Yes. Yeah, the language of othering, in some ways, this is trendy language, I think. We see it everywhere, don't we? And because it has such purchase in popular discourse, whether it's in social media or in reading the newspaper or in hearing interviews of celebrities, and because it has such discourse at the such purchase at the popular level, I wanted to employ this language because I am writing actually for the academy, but I'm hoping that informed lay readers and ministers will also pick up this book. And the whole concept of the other, it's a way of pathologizing difference. That is, someone is different from us, they are other, but a program of othering involves then taking their difference from us and labeling it in a negative way by caricaturing this person or this group, by oversimplifying the identity of this person or this group, by locating them within a very narrow definition of who they are, defining them by very stereotypical traits. So when I first came across this language of othering, it wasn't by reading the newspaper. It wasn't by watching, comedians on Netflix. I came across this by reading Johannine scholarship. So I wanted to capitalize on this. What does it mean for writers to say that John is guilty of othering when the ultimate other becomes flesh? There is an act of de-othering as well. So I do think that John is involved in what we would now label negative labeling, or what we would call othering. I do think he is involved in that, but I don't think it's necessarily along the lines that we often assume. So I think for John, the ultimate negative other would, of course, be the ruler of this world. It would be cosmic darkness personified in the ruler of this world. And for John, the closer one is aligned to that negative other of the cosmic entity of darkness, the more likely they are to be othered in a negative way within John's gospel.
But you also have I'm maybe jumping ahead a little bit of myself in the interview, but you also you have a section toward the end of the book where you talk about sort of a positive othering that takes place internally for the community. So what does it mean for the community to positively other itself?
Yes, right. So part of why there is such a sectarian interpretation of John is because of this difference. And over the course of the past 50 years, 60 years, we have been elaborating on these theories of communities behind the gospel text. We've got a Markan, Matthean, Lucan, and Johannine community. And then we've been able to, if we have a Johannine community, that we can then apply these sociological and social scientific models of the sect or the anti-society to this hypothesized community. And we're able to do this in some ways because John seems so different and seems to come from a group that is antagonized within society and responds to that society in an antagonistic way, in a hostile way, with its harsh language and its insular ethics. That's the way the reading goes in the sectarian hermeneutic, at least. Well, I think actually there is truth to this. John is different. John is understanding. John's coming out of a community that understands itself as other. And the language I use is that of self-othering. The Johannine network, I would say, it does perceive itself as aligned with the ultimate other, God, who through the Logos becomes flesh and dwells among us. And that otherness is actually a salvific otherness, if you will, because for John, only someone other can save, only someone from outside the matrix of our contemporary existence, only someone from outside the cosmic realm can enter in and actually save and rescue. And the Johannine vision of community is that of self-othering. We align ourselves with this other, but that is an other. I'm using this capital O with other, this divine other with which the Johannine followers are to align themselves. The other extends open arms, and it's out of that otherness that that this one is able to offer us a salvation that is actually viable within this cosmos.
And you actually you press some of that into the service of thinking about not just the theology of John, but actually the writing of John, or the genre of gospel, as perhaps, I mean, other but non-competitive. That's quite important to your critique of the sectarian hermeneutic, if I've understood you the right way. So you argue for the possible of this non-competitive diversity within the gospel tradition. So I just, what evidence do you see in John's gospel itself that he intends his gospel as other, but as perhaps a generative supplement and not as a replacement, a competitive replacement to the synoptic tradition?
Yes, the trend to interpret difference as enmity, diversity as an adversity to overcome, that's long embedded in our field of biblical studies. So if you see texts that emblematize something different than what the other text says, well, they must have been fighting this out. These had to have been rivals. They were combative. And, in some cases, that certainly had to have been the case. But I don't get the impression from early Christianity that just because Paul confronts Peter in Antioch, I mean, that had to have been a very disturbing scene. It doesn't mean that Paul hates Peter, and anything Petrine he would have shredded if he had gotten it on a piece of parchment, if Timothy had brought it along with him at some point. I don't think that we necessarily have to construe difference as enmity. John is most certainly different, and we see that clearly in the comparative readings of John and the other Gospels. But to get back to your question, what evidence do I see that John envisions what he's doing in gospel writing as a non-competitive act? I think it's in the colophons of John, actually, the closing of John 20 and the closing of John 21. There is an acknowledgement that Jesus has done other things. He has performed other signs. And guess what? We could keep writing and writing and writing, and the world itself cannot contain all that would be written. I think John is writing late enough that not only is he aware of at least one of the synoptics, I think he's probably aware at least of Mark and Luke. But if he is writing within this increasingly crowded field, as Francis Watson calls it, of gospel production, then I think we get a sense that he knows he's doing that he is aware his readers will know of other gospels. And it's that theology of superabundance, so many more things that Jesus has done. We could write books and books and books and never touch on, never fully be able to express the wonder and the depths and the riches of who Jesus is. I think it's in that theology of Christological superabundance that he feels free to write something that's different. And of course, there may be a bit of maybe a mild competitiveness. He certainly is wanting to situate his work as one that is absolutely authoritative, but doesn't mean that he wants to supplant the other gospel writers. I think his writing is one of wanting to situate his alongside what he knows. These are already accepted texts. I don't think he envisions replacing them as necessarily a possibility. He definitely wants his voice heard, but doesn't mean that he wants to that he envisions Mark as this nemesis out there with a pen that he wants to throw down by his own version. I obviously you can read this in multiple different ways, but I think we read too much toward the idea of Johannine enmity toward the other early Christian writers. And that's not necessary. I think those colophons help us to see there's space here. John envisions there being space for him to write something else that's different, but yet still can be situated alongside the Jesus tradition.
So when John writes, these things are written, he's not saying these things and not other things. He's saying these things I wrote, and there might also be other things that you should read alongside mine. Is that how we should take that?
I think so. I don't think he has a choice. I think the gospel texts are established enough, or at least some gospel texts are established enough that he knows other gospel texts are inevitable. I think what he's primarily trying to do is make sure we can read his work, these things that he has produced alongside those others.
Yeah, that sounds convincing to me. I like it. As someone who has to teach both the Synoptics and John and wants to make a case that we should, continue to teach John. Let's change things up a little bit. You're a listener to OnScript. Sometimes we do a speed round. I have a speed round.
Okay.
The rules for the speed round are that you answer with the first thing that comes into your head, and you don't have to defend your answer, but I also don't always follow my own rules, so
Okay.
good luck. Ready?
Yes.
Okay. What food tastes most like home?
Chick-fil-A, but I can't get it here.
Oh, well, that mixes my next question, which is what food do you most miss living in the UK as an American?
Well, I would say also Mexican food.
Oh.
That I know. We're having a lament, aren't we, together?
Yeah.
On this podcast.
Yeah.
I think now we love so much of the eating experience in the UK, but when something is labeled as Mexican food and we go, we're always disappointed. So
although you've now moved from Durham to Cambridge, and Durham and London are the only two places in the UK that I've ever had Mexican food that actually tastes good. Like, there's a good taco place in Durham and there's a good taco place in London. And both of those places are very far from where I live.
Yes. No, I know what you're talking about. In Durham, that restaurant came in our final year there, and I love that place.
That place, it's see, now we should have a pilgrimage to the Durham taco place. Please let it stay open because they don't seem to do well here.
That's so true.
Anyway. All right. What book in biblical studies or theology has most influenced you as a scholar?
Oh, wow. You think you're prepared for these things. I'm turning to look at the books on my shelf.
No cheating.
Oh yeah, that's cheating. I'm sorry. I'll tell you. Okay, first things that came to mind.
You can pick two.
Okay. Yeah, maybe Georgia Eldon Ladd, Theology of the New Testament, and Richard Hayes, Moral Vision of the New Testament.
What Harry Potter house would you be in?
I just hope it would be Gryffindor. That's my hope.
Now, on your bio, it says that you have a dog named Hagrid. Is that true? That's the best name for a dog.
Yeah, I confess it is true. And he is very cute and very annoying to me. Not to anyone else in my family, just to me. But he is cute.
Is he big?
No, he's tiny. He's small and fluffy. But that fits, right? Because Fang, whose name implies danger, is actually a big coward, as Hagrid himself puts it, and Fluffy is the scary one, who's gigantic. So we feel like the dog is well named.
Oh, well, that's great. What's one thing you wish all of your students knew?
Greek. Yeah, first thing came to mind.
Greek. Yeah. Tea or coffee?
Coffee.
And do you know how to make a proper cup of tea yet? After living here for 11 years?
Well, I think so. We used to host a cell group from our church at our house. And one of the aspects of hosting fellow Brits is that they're too kind to tell you if you haven't done it properly. So I hope for those 10 years that I made tea for everyone who came over to my house, I hope I did it right. But I'm not entirely sure they would have told me if I didn't.
No, that's true. They do subtly shame you if you don't offer them tea at the right time, which is a learning experience.
So I did always offer it. I'm just not sure if I delivered in what I offered.
Yeah.
They always smiled and accepted it, and they drank it. But I like the cups of tea that I make.
There you go.
And I have heard some positive comments, I have to say.
That's good.
From time to time, yeah.
Yeah, we had a subtle shaming. It wasn't even subtle when we were having our house remodeled. And we'd have builders come in and be like really offended that we didn't offer them cups of tea despite not having running water. Yeah, my American couldn't quite get over that. Okay, what's the scariest animal?
Oh, A virus?
Is that an animal?
Is that an animal? I don't know. Maybe not.
Okay. Animal.
Okay, first thing comes to mind is an alligator, because I grew up in the deep South, and I remember I studied forestry at undergrad at University of Georgia, and very helpful because the Bible does have a lot of trees in it. But but I remember going on a field trip, and we were out at night by this lake in South Georgia, and we shined a flashlight out there, and you could see the eyes glowing, and a sudden splash of water where it went underneath the water really quickly. And spending time on Cumberland Island, they scare me a bit.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
That's why I moved to England.
Yeah, exactly. There's no
Just kidding.
scary animals here. None. Yeah, after we lived in Colorado, and I think I'd be torn between like some sort of snake and a mountain lion. But
Oh, good point. Yeah,
Any-
and bears. My goodness.
yeah, they're not as
Oh my.
they don't hunt you though. Mountain lions hunt people. Anyway,
Yeah, that's true.
if you had to pick another profession, what would it be?
Oh, I would be a pastor.
Okay, if you had to pick a non-theological profession, what would it be?
Right. I would be a novelist.
Oh. Okay, favorite novel?
Ooh. Oh, that's tough. I love Les Mis. I love Watership Down. I love Brothers Karamazov.
So many choices.
Oh, no. Lord of the Rings is my favorite, though. That would be my favorite. I know that's a set of 3, but
yeah, I mean, how then you have to differentiate. Never mind. I'm not even going to ask you to do that.
I would say Return of the King then. Yeah. Although I was really disappointed when I read it the first time and realized the final third were all appendices. I thought I had a lot more pages left of the story. So yeah, so Return of the King perhaps.
And Andy, can you tell us a joke right now?
Oh, you put me on the spot. I'm constantly accused in my home of making terrible dad jokes all the time, but none of them come to mind. Maybe one of my kids has to walk in the room, and then I could do it. Do you have one?
Do I have a joke? No, I'm not giving answers.
Wow, I wish this were more fun, but yeah.
I mean, Andy is a dad of 4 kids, right?
That's right.
4 kids. How do you not have a dad joke?
Most of my dad jokes I make up on the spot. I think that's the problem.
My daughter loves dad jokes, like passionately loves bad dad jokes.
Oh, good for her. Bless her.
Yeah.
That will change soon.
Yeah, I know. I mean, she's getting to the point where she's embarrassed at the very thought of having parents, so we're just, we're looking forward to that. Yeah, okay, so shifting gears entirely back to the interview, on a much more serious subject, let's dive into this very polemical language in the Gospel of John, because the polemical language against the Judai really, I mean, it's problematic, but let's pinpoint it further, and it comes to a head in John 8, where on the lips of Jesus we hear, why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot accept my word. You are from your father, the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. So how does this strong statement fit in your understanding of John's program of othering and de-othering?
This scene in John 8, and particularly the verse you referred to, John 8:44, this haunts me. I'm sitting here at my desk and I'm looking at Susanna Heschel's book, The Aryan Jesus. I keep right here next to me. And I want to be constantly reminded of how this text can be interpreted and how it has been interpreted. And I'm wanting to, as someone who works within the life of the church and trains future ministers of the gospel, who loves John's gospel, I don't want that text to mean what other people have said that it means. But that's not reason to defend it. So this chapter I have called John and Other Jews is dedicated to working exegetically throughout John's gospel, how he is presenting the identity of the people of God and what might be happening here in this scene. So the starting point of the conversation is often, it's either John 4:22 or John 8:44. So those who see John as anti-Jewish will begin the conversation usually with John 8:44, where Jesus says, "You are of your father the devil." But those who would defend John or explain away, perhaps, as Adele Reinhardt has put it, who would explain away or who would defend John as not being anti-Jewish, might point to John 4:22, where Jesus he says salvation comes from the Jews. And we see in that scene that Jesus, of course, is recognized as a Judaios, as a Jew. My starting point is the prologue. And in the prologue, we have established immediately that the identity of the people of God, according to John, are not born out of blood, out of the will of the husband. They're not born out of flesh. They are born ek theou. They are born out of God. So right from the beginning, John is doing something, I think, very similar to what Luke and Matthew do, who also have in the very beginning, or very early on at least, they have John the Baptist accusing certain Jewish leaders of wanting to rely on the laurels of their biological descent. Hey, God can raise up children of Abraham from these stones, says John the Baptist in Luke and in Matthew. John, even earlier, establishes that what we're looking at, what he's interested in here, is presenting Jesus through whom the people of God are construed as being not ethnically defined, but divinely determined, born ek theou, born out of God. And of course, we see that theme developed throughout John's gospel. A particularly important scene is one with Nicodemus. One must be born from above, right, from the divine sphere. And when we come to John chapter 8, what I think John is polemically opposed to is what I call in the book an ethnicizing of soteriology, or a racializing of ecclesiology. I think that John is a Jewish writer who is opposed to any vision of salvation or covenant membership that's premised primarily on or solely on biological descent. And what we see happening in that scene is a reliance of those he is engaged with in conversation and discussion. We see his interlocutors who are appealing to their Abrahamic descent. And John has no problem with acknowledging, Jesus acknowledges that, yes, of course, we know that you are seed, sperma of Abraham. So he recognizes their biological descent from Abraham. But this does not make them children of Abraham. And what Jesus seems to be attacking, even though he is addressing a group that we recognize as being labeled through an ethnic identifier, hoi Judaioi, the Jews, what he's criticizing in this scene is not their ethnicity, it's not their biological descent, it's not ethnicity, it's their ethics that he's questioning here. Because they have aligned themselves with lying and murder, which are the characteristic traits in the Johannine literature for the devil, for cosmic darkness. So I think in this scene, what we see happening is not a racial slur. What we see happening here is John sharply criticizing what he perceives as malevolent intent to kill, which that's what's associated with the devil. That's what's diabolical. Being Jewish isn't diabolical for John. It's being murderous, having murderous intent. So the whole language of Judaioi, why would John, if he is a Jewish writer, why would he label as the primary enemies of Jesus, at least on the human sphere within his narrative, why would he have a Jew negatively addressing other Jews as the Jews? I think it's because John is granting the preferred self-designation of these interlocutors of Jesus, who envision that the primary means of covenant belonging, the primary means of soteriological prerequisite, that's defined ethnically. You must be a Judaios. And then we know that this was happening in early Judaism. Now, John is a Jew who, like other Jews at the time, had a much more broader understanding of Jewish identity. It's not just a Christian this isn't just a Christian reading. This is also an early Jewish critique of another early Jewish idea that Israel was solely ethnic Israel. And I think John is granting the preferred self-designation of Judaioi to these Jews who want people to be Judaioi in order to be in God's covenant family.
That's really helpful. Can you, but you do argue that John is making an exclusive theological claim about who the people of God are. You talk about Jesus as the Johannine gate. Mm-hmm. And so is it fair to say that that John does have an otherness that's theologically determined?
I think it would be wrong to present John as a Christian writer who offers this universal Christian inclusivism that challenges the Jewish exclusivism. What's happening is that John is being exclusivist, but he's doing it in a different way. By exclusivist, that is, there is an othering. There is a difference between the people of God and those who are not the people of God. He is criticizing an ethnic way of determining who's in and who's out. But he does offer a way that recognizes some are in and some are out. But it's not ethnically determined, it's confessionally determined. So Jesus becomes one's orientation toward Jesus, one's reception of Jesus. That's what determines covenant membership. Now that's controversial in and of itself, but it isn't you must be ethnically Jewish in order to be part of God's family. But John does present the idea that one must receive Jesus, one must receive the Logos in order to be a part of this divine family. So I think it would be wrong. I think often, I mentioned this in the book, that there is a different way of being anti-Jewish. Is when you say, well, Judaism is exclusivist and Christianity is open to all. That can also be a way of being anti-Jewish, can't it? So I think it's just important to be honest with the fact that there are different ways of othering here. But John is criticizing an ethnic othering and wants to offer, by universalistic, it means that you don't have to come from a particular biological orientation or a genealogy in order to receive Jesus, but the reception of Jesus is the primary way of membership, according to John.
And I think that's very well explained, both here and in your book. My question is, and it's probably the most pressing, probing question that I'm going to ask you, because it's the one that lingers with me as I teach the Gospel of John as a non-Jewish, confessional Christian. But is John's theologically driven otherness that we see, and I think you've articulated really well, is that otherness less problematic than the ethnic otherness that we could see, and is it less problematic to say that John is theologically driven in his othering of the Jews when we set that against the backdrop of anti-Judaism? Or does this theological otherness, properly understood, should it lead us somewhere fundamentally different than the anti-Semitism that has so often and too often been funded by the polemical words in John's Gospel? Does that make sense?
I think so, and I will make a stab at answering this, and you can feel free to steer me, okay? If I'm not following.
I teach John. I am not a Johannine expert because you're your own little enclave. You're trying to break out of it, but it's.
Now wait a minute.
No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
Johannine scholars as the sectarians within biblical scholarship. Yeah,
that's a little bit true. I wonder to the degree to which this sectarian hermeneutic or sectarian reading of John is just a spinning out of the sectarian identity of Johannine scholars within the guild. Like that.
That's an amazing question. That deserves. There's a book right there, and maybe you should write. But I think some of us in gospel scholarship. So I like to think of myself more as a gospel scholar, but I am primarily doing stuff with John. I do look at the Paul folks, and I think, they are in their own little world as well over there, and they don't pay attention to the fact that we've got these gospels that are really amazing about Jesus. Anyway. I love all these texts, and interacting with these scholars, I learned so much from them. But there's a bit of competition, isn't there, between gospel scholars and Pauline scholars at times. You may not know this, but I think there is. Yeah.
If I don't know it, it's because there's not really a competition. It's not really a competition. Sorry.
All right, I'll just take that. So, is the theological otherness that John brings, is it better than? Is that part of what you're asking? Is it better than this other form of otherness?
I mean, is it less problematic to say that John has an otherness that's
Mhm.
theological, not it's not, it's not anti-Semitic in that it's naming and excluding an ethnic group, but it is theological. Does that lead us to a different
Yes, I see.
place, a different conclusion, or a different ethic, or a different action?
I will preface the response by saying that that the response that the vision that John wants to counter, that one must be ethnically Jewish to be a covenant member of Israel, that is not necessarily that is not the Jewish way of thinking about Israel. That is one way of thinking about Israel that John wants to counter and challenge. But there are other Jewish ways of thinking about Israel at the time John's writing. And John is one of them, who has a very Jewish way of thinking about Israel, which is an Israel reconstituted around Messiah, who is Jesus, according to John. And so what might be the advantage of this theological otherness versus an ethnicizing otherness? Is it less problematic? I think it's just problematic in different ways, actually. And one could argue that the advantage would be that no one is excluded. Race and ethnicity are not exclusionary, all right? But there is still this reception of Jesus that that is still exclusionary, but that reception of Jesus, one is not already predisposed in one way or another on the basis of their DNA. So I think there are some riches there for us to explore, but again, that sort of racial or that ethnic, that exclusion, being exclusive on the basis of race and ethnicity that we see John challenging in John chapter 8 and throughout various scenes in the gospel, again, that is not the sole idea of, that doesn't represent monolithically Judaism at the time, or Judaism today necessarily. So this theological otherness is problematic in different ways, particularly as we think about John and read John within a very pluralistic and highly secularized society. But I do want to draw attention to the fact that throughout John's gospel, even though there is this sharp cosmological dualism, even though there is this distinction between light and darkness, there is a divine other who becomes flesh and de-others, but yet the reception of this de-othering other creates a different form of othering in a way. Even so, John creates a lot of ambiguity in his depiction of characters. So there is a very clear depiction of light and dark, but then when you actually read the story, things are not as straightforward at times as you might think. And I think that ambiguity is something that we really do need to attend to as we look at how this might be proclaimed from churches in our contemporary cultural moment. We don't always know exactly what's going on, and where people fall along these cosmological dualistic lines. It's not always quite as straightforward, and John himself allows for quite a bit of gray and for characters to be on journeys, actually, on a bit of a journey. But there is a gate. Jesus is the gate, the door. And I think the idea of Jesus as a gate is extremely important because there is this idea of invitation that John extends, that the gate, Jesus, extends. And that gate seems to open to the outsider, but also it does seem to swing the other way as well, so that the insider can leave. We see that in the epistles a bit. So, yeah, I think that's important to recognize that within this other way of reconstructing Israel and the people of God around the person of Jesus, this person is presented to us as a gate, and there's invitation, as well as there's openness to egress as well as ingress, coming and going.
Thanks, that's helpful. And I have to ask a Pauline scholar reading a book on Johannine studies question now, because you've mentioned this a few times. You make this point that the real enemy in John's gospel is this cosmic enemy, which makes Johannine theology sound, at least in your version of it, really like apocalyptic in its talk of cosmic stages and of death and of the evil one. And is that typical in Johannine studies, or do you catch flack for these very large grand sweeping statements about cosmic stages, like we do sometimes when we talk in this way in Pauline studies?
Well, for me, using this language just feels very Johannine, actually. I mean, cosmos is a very key term that he's using. And yeah, the idea of a sort of penetration of our own cosmic sphere by through the incarnation. This is heaven sort of trespassing into the cosmic domain. Yeah, that feels that's all very Johannine and feels quite at home, I think, in an apocalyptic framework. I'm not catching flack for this yet. Maybe it's because I haven't been on many podcasts with Pauline scholars yet, but actually, there are some works that are looking into this. My friend Ben at Tyndale College, he's got a book from with Oxford University Press looking at this. So I think there's quite a bit of work to be done in apocalypticism in John, and some scholars are doing it. But I do find John as a very I find that John and Paul have a lot in common, and even with this idea of Israel and the idea of Abrahamic lineage. I think there's quite a bit that Paul and John have in common.
Oh, well, it warmed my heart as someone who reads Paul fairly apocalyptically. So, yeah, it just made me feel like, oh, it is, well, maybe it's not, maybe people would argue that it's in John and it's not in Paul, but. So you move in the chapters between this kind of cosmic plane and then down into, sort of seamlessly, into the nitty-gritty of John's audience and its historical context to talk about things that are a little more concrete, like the Johannine community and like ecclesiology. And you've written an entire book on this, so I'm sure you could talk about this at length. But can you just give us a brief sketch here on your take on John's ecclesiology, if he has one?
Sure. My first monograph on John begins with, this book is not about the community behind the text, but on the vision of the Johannine community within the text. And that is primarily what my concern has been. But there is a history here, and this is, I think, one of the great gifts of Lou Martin's work, History and Theology in the Fourth Gospel, is he recognizes that this text does not just fall as some spiritual document from heaven into our ecclesial laps. This thing came out of actual historical realities and struggles. But as I talk about in the book, the problem with the construction of historical communities, and it's a problem that Martin was very well aware of, and so was Brown, and both of them highly qualified their work. The problem is that once we produce and reconstruct a hypothetical community, then we sort of concretize our hypothesis by rereading the text through the lens of that community. And as biblical scholars oriented so deeply toward history, it's very difficult for us to work without a history. We want to throttle these texts until they will give us one. And when we finally get the Johannine community in place, and we then can create lengthy chronological details about who they were and what was happening to them. The problem is when we hold that too tightly, and for me, I do think there is a Johannine network is the language I would prefer to use than Johannine community. I think John is networked. Not only is there a group of Christians that we might look back and say are Johannine, they meet in different locations, and I think they actually are also connected with other Christian groups. We can't know much more than that. I also think that this network is predominantly Jewish, at least began to be in its beginnings, was primarily predominantly Jewish. So I think the overall idea that Martin has presented, and Brown as well, and others have developed this, that there was an intra-Jewish conflict, I think that makes sense of the text, but I don't want to press those details too far and then reconstruct too tidily this idea of who these people are. So I am trying to work with history, but doing it in a way that doesn't concretize a hypothesis that can't be proven. John's ecclesiology. So John's ecclesiology arises out of this, and I think what we have here is a Jewish group of people who have come to the conviction that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah and is divine in some extraordinary way. And I think they've been pressed by fellow Jews. They've been accused of betraying their own scriptural and theological traditions. And so Johannine ecclesiology, I think, arises out of constructing Israel as conceived around the divine Christ, Jesus, and the identity of this ecclesial identity is premised no longer on, or not on the basis of ethnicity, but on the basis of Jesus' reception. And once Jesus is received, there is this idea that I call it theosis. That's very controversial, I know, but there is this idea of the people of God becoming divine. They are birthed out of God in some way, born from above. So John's ecclesiology is that of a divine community in kinship with the Father and the Son. I'm going to go there. By the Holy Spirit. I just went and became very Trinitarian there. I think that is at least implied in John's text. So this is a vision of Israel that is divine, but premised on reception of Jesus.
And most of the time when Johannine scholars talk about John's ecclesiology, they're very quick to point out that this divine community, as John conceives, is non-hierarchical. It doesn't have the hierarchy of the early church. And you want to make the case that actually an episcopal ecclesiology and John's charismatic pneumatology are not at odds with each other. So convince the listeners that John can be both charismatic in his pneumatology and have some place for episcopal hierarchy.
Yes, Erin, you are right. This is standard in readings of John's ecclesiology, is that John is anti-hierarchical. To continue on with the prefix anti, John is anti-hierarchical. And
yeah, but we like him for that.
Well,
kind of.
Careful now. You are in an Anglican seminary.
But the guild kind of likes him for that. I don't like the other antis. But we like this one.
Yeah, no, that is true. That is true. There is this sort of ongoing love-hate with John. It is interesting. You see this in the scholarship of the mid and late 20th century, what we see in Bultmann, don't we? So this idea that John is not Catholic in its structures, all right? I say that because a lot of German Protestant scholarship is producing some of this literature. So John is viewed as very low church. And now that is my background. I'm ordained as a Baptist minister, all right? And so I'm teaching in an Anglican seminary, but what I find very interesting in these discussions in Johannine scholarship is that I wonder if we are mapping some of our own contemporary ecclesiological ideas back onto the first century and early second century. And I share in the book a story of me sitting in a coffee shop. I was doing some studies, doing something very responsible, I'm sure, and studying something, working on a lecture, I don't know. And I overheard a friend of mine sitting at a nearby table, wait, what is even this? How is this possible? And I asked, for the sake of conversation, what are you talking about? And they come across this story in some magazine they were reading about a charismatic Anglican. Shocking. Charismatic Catholics. But wait, how is this possible? Because there is a contemporary stereotype we have that if you are spirit-filled, then you're not going to have the spirit quenched by things like hierarchies and liturgies. And I wonder if that stereotype, that caricature of how spirit-filled charismatic Christianity works, I wonder if that's been mapped back onto the Johannine community in a way. All right. So now that there are some reasons why John is viewed as being anti-hierarchical, but I do wonder if we are operating out of some of assumptions that you can't be charismatic and liturgical, charismatic and hierarchical. In fact, it may well be that the reason Diotrephes and John are at odds is because Diotrephes does not recognize some form of what we might call episcopal authority residing in John. And I don't think that John was necessarily hierarchical or liturgical, but I do think to make these sweeping statements and to just dismiss John as, again, anti the rest of early Christianity that was developing these liturgical and hierarchical structures within its worship life, I think that's unfounded. And I use the example of Ignatius of Antioch. We attribute to Ignatius of Antioch, it's Ignatius that we find the most developed form of the threefold ministry of episkopos, bishop, elder, and deacon. And actually, when you read through these early letters that we have from Ignatius, he premises his whole theology of church hierarchy on themes that John would find actually very familiar. This idea of reciprocity, this idea of participation. We see John doing the same sort of thing in his gospel, and we even detect, I think, a bit of it in the epistles as well. So I'm just trying to problematize this easy dismissal of John as, oh yes, sectarian and anti-early Catholicism, because clearly John does not like there to be any hierarchies, because John places emphasis on the Spirit who speaks in the life of the community. These things are not incompatible. And that's the point of that chapter, John and Other Christians. I think it's part 2.
Yeah, and then you conclude your book with a chapter on Johannine theology, which is very theological, appropriately so. And you give a full, I mean, and yeah, for a biblical scholar, I mean, it's really refreshing to read that sort of just weighty. I mean, it seems weighty to me, dogmatic category using exegesis of these texts. So I would really commend, if people are interested in theological reading, this is a book that has some really, really rich theological reading. And I was particularly interested in well, and you've talked about it at length in this interview even, but in your Christology, but you've fleshed that out further in this chapter, and you talk about triadic divinity, and Johannine otherness in triadic divinity. And then I guess the question that I have, well, first of all, what do you mean by the otherness in the Trinity? Like, how does that play out in John?
Sure.
And then I wonder if you could say a bit more about how human otherness might image this divine otherness.
Yes, so I've referred in the podcast so far to this idea of the ultimate other becoming flesh, and that is an act of de-othering at a cosmic level, and at the nitty-gritty level as well. And what I see embodied in John's theology is a perichoretic otherness. So perichoresis, this idea of internal interaction of the divine figures. John so creatively opens with the Logos and the Theos. And when you read those opening lines, you sort of think at first, oh, these are equated. But then you read the next clause, oh, these are distinguished from one another. Then the next clause, oh, they're the same. And then the very next clause, oh, they're distinguished again. So there is this plurality and unity together. And so you have these two figures who are unified. They are one, but yet they are other from one another. And of course, the way the Spirit is brought in later in John's Gospel as an extra narrative character primarily, you can envision that this perichoretic otherness of divinity includes the Spirit. So right there within John's theology of the Father, of the Son, and of the Paraclete, there is a perichoretic otherness in which one can be other without being antagonistic. Otherness does not necessarily mean enmity or antagonism. This, I think, has so much to teach us in our contemporary society. This idea that otherness and difference can actually be a means by which unity and oneness can be embodied. And we see it at the very heart of John's theology. But then John's vision of this perichoretic otherness, it opens up to include the human other, the mortal other. And so there is this invitation all throughout John's Gospel, and we see it more fleshed out in the epistles at times, in which the mortal other, the sinful mortal other, is actually invited to be included within, can participate within the perichoretic otherness of divinity. If God can be other within himself and can invite the other who is mortal within a sort of divine kinship, that says quite a bit to a contemporary world full of othering and division, that unity and plurality can coexist in some powerful and beautiful way.
Yeah. Andy, what are your hopes for this book?
I suppose I hope people might read it. That's always a hope when you write a book.
Other than that, if we reach higher than people reading it, which I'm sure they will.
You never know. It's hard. You just never know. You never know with these things. I hope they will read it, and I hope that the sectarian hermeneutic, this default way of reading the Johannine literature as inherently insular, unconcerned with an outward orientation toward those who are different from it. I hope that this sectarian hermeneutic is blunted. Maybe even that it crumbles a bit. I also hope that I feel at times that the shibboleth of Johannine studies that one must say at the door to get a seat at the table is John is anti-Jewish. I almost feel like we have to say that. Now, what I think would be absolutely wrong would be to deny John's role, even if it's inadvertent. I would say it's an inadvertent role. John's role in the long and horrific history of anti-Judaism. That would be wrong to deny that. But I hope that we don't have to say John is anti-Jewish just to get a seat at the table, because I think exegetically we can show that something more is going on than an anti-ethnic label, or a demonizing of ethnicity. I don't think that's what is happening. It's a demonizing of the demonic. So I hope that this goes some way toward exegetically and responsibly deconstructing anti-Jewish ways of reading and interpreting John. I'm not just saying that because I want fellow scholars not to say John is anti-Jewish. I don't want fellow Christians to be reading this text and thinking it means, oh, now we can hold up placards at, Unite the Right rallies that call Jews Satan's children. So I'm hoping that the book will go some way towards killing that reading. And I also hope it becomes, I hope I hope it goes some way towards restoring John as a valid text for contemporary society, a text that has something to teach us. John is a text that does come from the margins. I don't deny that. And actually, as a voice from the margins, it has something to say about power. And, I think we see in Johannine resistance. It is not violent. It's not retributive. Put your sword back into its sheath, Jesus says to Peter. Johannine justice is restorative. It's not punitive. And John is honest about cosmic evil. And I think in a secular world where you don't have some sense of cosmic darkness out there, we don't demonize demons. We demonize one another. And I think this honesty that there is cosmic darkness out there with which we can align ourselves, I think that's actually extremely important. So I hope that we blunt the sectarian hermeneutic. I hope that this book helps blunt that sectarian hermeneutic in reading John. I hope it undermines any sort of anti-Jewish interpretation of John. And I also hope it helps us think through how to be human in contemporary society.
Modest goals, right? I read this book on my vacation, which I think, but it was such it was a really life-giving book to read because it does feel really relevant for being a monograph. It's hard to write a relevant monograph, so well done for that.
Thank you.
OnScript listeners, that's all the time we have today. We've been speaking to Dr. Andy Byers about his new book, John and the Others, which you can pick up at your favorite purveyor of niche academic books. Andy, thanks so much for joining us. And thanks to all of you for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Erin.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.